When my daughter uninvited me from Christmas to coddle her father's new young wife, she thought I'd weep in isolation. I'm Annette Ross, 54, a structural safety inspector. They forgot that when you spend 30 years analyzing broken foundations, you learn exactly how to survive a collapse. The wind coming off Lake Superior in late December doesn't just blow, it claws. It rattles the loose pane in my kitchen window, the one I've been meaning to glaze since October, and carries the scent of deep water and freezing pine. I was sitting at my scrubbed pine kitchen table, a mug of black tea warming my palms, when my daughter, Lauren, called. It was December 23rd. Outside, the streetlights of Duluth were haloed in a thick, swirling haze of lake-effect snow. I had my wool socks pulled up high and my father's old flannel shirt thrown over my shoulders. I was looking forward to the quiet comfort of our traditional Christmas Eve, just the two of us, baking Swedish tea rings and watching the old movies we both knew by heart. "Mom," Lauren started, her voice carrying that high-pitched, breathless quality she only used when she was trying to negotiate her way out of a corner. "I need to talk to you about tomorrow night. It's about the dinner at the Lakeside Pavilion." The Lakeside Pavilion was the crown jewel of her father's new real estate empire. Richard had spent the last 3 years building it, a sprawling glass and timber monstrosity jutting out over the freezing waters of the lake. "I'm already wrapping the gifts, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice level, though a cold knot was already forming in my stomach. "I found that vintage wool throw you wanted." "Yeah, about that," she stammered, the silence on the line stretching thin. We think it's better if you don't come tomorrow. Dad's hosting the winter gala there, and Chloe is really anxious. It's her first Christmas as part of the family, and she's feeling incredibly insecure about her position. She wants to establish her own traditions with us. We're trying to make her feel like she belongs, Mom. You understand, right? It would just be so awkward with both of you in the same room. We can do a nice lunch in January, just you and me. I want you to take a moment and think about that. If you have ever sat at your own table, surrounded by the ghosts of the sacrifices you made to raise a child, only to be told you're too inconvenient for their new, shinier life, then you know how the air leaves your lungs. It's not a sharp pain. It's a dull, heavy ache, like a structural beam that has been carrying too much weight for too many years, finally beginning to split. I raised Lauren. When Richard walked out 5 years ago to find his truth, which apparently meant a 28-year-old yoga instructor named Chloe and a fleet of leased German sports cars, I was the one who stayed in this drafty house. I took the double shifts inspecting bridge abutments in the freezing rain to pay off Lauren's college tuition. I wore the same winter coat for 7 years so she could have the textbook money and the meal plans. And now I was being put on a shelf like an outdated appliance because the new wife felt insecure. "I see," I said. My voice didn't tremble. 30 years of dealing with slippery contractors and corner-cutting developers teaches you how to keep your voice perfectly flat. You want to make Chloe feel like family. "Exactly. I knew you'd get it," Lauren said, a rush of relief flooding her tone. She didn't even notice the chill in my response. To her, my compliance was just a given. I was Mom. I was the reliable foundation. You don't think about the foundation of a house until the basement floods. You just assume it will always hold you up. "Thank you so much, Mom. You're the strongest person I know. Have a good Christmas, okay?" When the line went dead, the silence in my kitchen was absolute, save for the rhythmic hum of the old refrigerator. I looked down at my hands. They were rough, the skin around the knuckles dry from decades of working outdoors. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my mug. I simply walked over to the sink, washed the mug, and turned off the Christmas tree lights. My ex-husband, Richard, had always been a man of grand facades. He was a developer who cared about the granite countertops and the smart home integration, but never paid attention to the load-bearing walls or the soil compaction reports. When we divorced, he walked away with the flashy assets, leaving me this modest house and my pension. He married Chloe 6 months after the ink dried on our paperwork. Chloe was young enough to be his daughter, a woman whose entire existence seemed curated for social media feeds. Lauren, caught up in the glamour of her father's sudden wealth, had slowly been sucked into their orbit. She started talking about branding and networking. She stopped visiting my quiet kitchen, preferring the heated infinity pool at Richard's North Shore estate. Christmas Eve arrived with the wrath of a true Great Lakes blizzard. By 6:01 p.m., the wind was screaming at 50 miles an hour, driving a blinding sheet of white across Duluth. The city was shutting down. Snowplows were struggling to keep up, and the police were advising everyone to stay off the roads. I sat in my living room, reading a technical manual on concrete degradation, my version of a peaceful evening, when my phone rang. It wasn't Lauren. It was Silas Thorne. Silas was the chief emergency coordinator for the county. We had worked together on dozens of storm recoveries over the years. He was a gruff, honest man who had lost his wife to cancer a decade ago and knew a thing or two about lonely holidays. "Annette, are you home?" Silas's voice was strained, competing with the roar of static and wind in the background. "I'm here, Silas. Safe and warm. What's wrong?" "We've got a critical situation down at the Lakeside Pavilion," he said, and my heart skipped a beat. "The snow load on the roof has exceeded the safety margins. They've got over 300 people inside for a VIP charity gala. The local district inspector is out with the flu, and the backup is stuck in a ditch on Highway 61. I need your eyes, Annette. The fire marshal is threatening to evacuate, but the developers are protesting, saying it's just a minor drift. They're refusing to clear the hall." "Who is the developer on record?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Ross Development," Silas grunted. "Richard's outfit. He's down there right now, claiming the building is rated for twice this load. But our sensors are showing structural deflection in the main laminated timber arches. Annette, if those arches give way under this wet snow, the whole roof is coming down on 300 people. Your daughter is down there too, isn't she?" I closed my eyes. The image of Lauren, dressed up in whatever expensive gown Richard had bought her to match Chloe's aesthetic, popped into my mind. She had cast me aside to be there. She had chosen the glittering, fragile glass house over the solid, unglamorous mother who loved her. But I am a structural safety inspector. My duty isn't to my pride. It's to the lives of the people inside those walls, even the ones who hurt me. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Silas," I said. "Have the schematics ready on the county server, and tell the fire department to have their heavy rescue gear on standby." I pulled on my thermal layers, my heavy-duty insulated work boots, and my bright yellow safety parka with the reflective strips. I grabbed my digital level, my laser measuring tool, and my trusty steel-toed boots. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror. I didn't look like a woman who had been rejected. I looked like a woman who was about to do her job. The drive down to the lakefront was treacherous. My old four-wheel drive truck groaned as it plowed through the drifts, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the heavy, wet snow. The lake was a black, churning void to my right, throwing frozen spray over the retaining walls. As I approached the Lakeside Pavilion, the building glowed like a giant lantern in the storm, its massive glass walls showcasing the glittering warmth inside. Valet parkers in high-end winter gear were scrambling to move luxury SUVs, their faces red from the biting cold. Inside, wealthy patrons were sipping champagne, completely oblivious to the thousands of tons of wet, heavy snow pressing down on the wide-span timber roof above their heads. As I pushed through the heavy service doors, the roar of the wind was suddenly cut off, replaced by the warmth of central heating and the soft, ambient hum of a jazz trio playing a festive tune. The contrast was jarring. I stood in the service corridor, steam rising from my yellow parka, my salt-stained boots pooling water on the polished concrete. Silas was waiting for me in the building's primary mechanical room, a cavernous concrete space tucked behind the grand ballroom. The air in here didn't smell like expensive perfume or roasted prime rib. It smelled of damp concrete, hot copper coils, and grease. Silas was pacing in front of a wall of electrical panels, a rugged government-issue tablet clutched in his thick, weathered hands. His uniform was damp from the storm, and his face was lined with the kind of exhaustion only public servants in the middle of a natural disaster truly understand. "Thank God you made it, Annette," Silas said, stepping forward to hand me a steaming paper cup of black coffee from a plastic carafe. "The roads are a complete mess. I didn't think you'd get through the drift on the Canal Park Bridge." "My truck has seen worse, Silas," I said, taking the cup. The heat of the paper curled into my stiff fingers, a small mercy against the chill that had settled into my bones during the drive. "Show me what you've got." What are the sensors saying? He tapped the screen of his tablet, pulling up the real-time telemetry from the building's structural monitoring system. Because the Lakeside Pavilion was built on a municipal lease, the county required real-time deflection sensors to be integrated into the main timber arches, a safety compromise Richard had whined about for 6 months during the planning phases. The main span is 120 feet of laminated Douglas fir arches, Silas explained, pointing a thick finger at a flashing yellow icon on the screen. The sensor at the crown of arch number 3 is showing 4 inches of downward deflection. The design limit for a dry snow load is supposed to be 3. But look at this, Annette. The rate of deflection isn't leveling off. It's accelerating. Every 10 minutes, it drops another fraction of an inch. I stared at the numbers, my professional training instantly taking over, pushing the ache of Lauren's rejection into a dark corner of my mind. I set my coffee down on a metal toolbox and pulled my own ruggedized laptop from my canvas work bag. I didn't rely on the county's simplified interface. I had the raw, unedited construction filings from the municipal archive loaded onto my hard drive. If you have ever had to dig through the fine print of a contract or a blueprint to find where someone tried to cut a corner at your expense, you know the feeling of your eyes straining against the screen in the dead of night. It's a quiet, cold anger. You realize that while you were playing by the rules, someone else was looking for a trapdoor. Silas, I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling up the original structural engineering submittals from 3 years ago. Look at the engineering stamp on these original designs. It's from Miller & Associates out of Minneapolis. They're top tier. They specified Grade 1 architectural glulam beams with heavy steel tie rods beneath the floor slab to prevent the arches from spreading under lateral loads. Right, Silas nodded. That's what was approved by the Planning Commission. But look at the amendment filed 18 months later, I said, highlighting a PDF document deep in the submittal history. My heart beat a heavy, steady rhythm against my ribs. Richard filed an as-built substitution variance. He cited supply chain delays. He replaced the architectural-grade Douglas fir with a cheaper utility-grade pine laminate from an uncertified supplier in southern Canada. And look at the connector plates, Silas. He swapped the custom-fabricated half-inch structural steel gussets for pre-stamped quarter-inch plates. He saved himself nearly $300,000 on the roof assembly alone. Silas let out a low whistle, his jaw tightening. That's a Class A building violation if the local inspector didn't sign off on it. How did this get past the city? It got past them because the final inspection was performed during the transition period when the city's building department was understaffed, and the inspector of record was a guy who retired 2 weeks later to a condo in Florida, I said, my voice flat. A condo in a building that Richard's development company just happened to construct. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with a sickening click. Richard hadn't just built a beautiful modern pavilion for the city. He had built a monument to his own greed, using cheap materials to create a luxury facade, and he had used his political connections to bury the evidence. And now my daughter was sitting under 300 tons of wet, heavy snow supported by pine beams that were never meant to carry that kind of weight. I want to speak directly to those of you who have ever been told that you're being too sensitive or too cautious when you point out a crack in the foundation of your family or your life. They call us worrywarts. They call us dramatic. But we are the ones who keep the roof from falling. We are the ones who look at the numbers because the numbers don't lie to make you feel better. I need to see the physical connections, I told Silas, pulling my safety harness out of my bag and strapping it over my yellow parka. The sensors tell us there's deflection, but I need to see if the timber is checking or if the connector bolts are shearing. If those plates are bending, this roof won't make it to midnight. The access ladder to the utility catwalk is at the end of the service corridor, Silas said, his eyes filled with concern. Annette, be careful up there. The wind is hitting those glass walls at 50 miles an hour. If the structure is shifting, the catwalks might be unstable. I've spent 30 years on unfinished bridges in the middle of November, Silas, I said, tightening the steel buckles of my harness. A drafty ballroom ceiling isn't going to scare me. I walked out of the mechanical room and down the narrow concrete corridor. As I neared the access door to the main hall, I could hear the muffled sound of laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the warm, rich tones of a live jazz singer performing "Have yourself a merry little Christmas." It was a surreal contrast, the wealthy elite of Duluth celebrating their charity while standing directly beneath a structural failure in progress. I stopped by the service door, which had a small reinforced glass window looking out into the grand ballroom. I couldn't help myself. I leaned in and looked. The room was stunning. Towering pine trees decorated with thousands of white fairy lights lined the glass walls, casting a warm glow over the guests. Women in elegant silk and velvet gowns laughed as they sipped champagne, while men in tailored tuxedos patted each other on the back. And there, near the center of the room, stood Richard. He was 58, but looked 10 years younger. His silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Beside him was Chloe, draped in a shimmering silver dress that looked like liquid mercury, her young face glowing with the triumph of being the center of attention. And then I saw Lauren. She was standing next to Chloe, holding a glass of white wine, laughing at something Chloe had said. Lauren was wearing a beautiful emerald green dress. She looked happy. She looked like she belonged in that world of effortless wealth and glittering light. She looked like she had completely forgotten about the mother who was sitting at a scrubbed pine table with a single mug of tea just 2 hours ago. A sharp, familiar pain flared in my chest, but I didn't let it take root. I took a deep, steadying breath, the cool, metallic air of the service corridor filling my lungs. I looked at the massive timber arches curving high above their heads, spanning the entire width of the room. From this distance, they looked solid and majestic. But I knew the truth. I knew what lay beneath the dark stain and the polished finish. I turned away from the window, grabbed my digital level and my high-intensity inspection flashlight, and climbed the cold steel rungs of the utility ladder leading up into the darkness of the ceiling plenum. The air up here was freezing, whistling through the gaps in the roof, decking where the heavy wind was forcing its way inside. The catwalk was a narrow grid of galvanized steel, suspended 30 feet above the ballroom floor by thin steel rods. Below me, the ceiling panels blocked most of the light, but the music and the laughter still drifted up through the ventilation grates, thin and tinny. I crawled along the catwalk, my knees cold against the steel, until I reached the crown of arch number 3. I shone my flashlight onto the main connection point. My breath hitched. The quarter-inch steel gusset plate, the cheap substitution Richard had made to save a buck, was visibly bowing. The heavy steel bolts that held the two halves of the timber arch together were tilting inward, the wood around them splintering under the immense crushing pressure of the snow load above. A thick, sticky bead of pine sap was oozing from the fresh cracks in the wood, looking like amber tears in the bright beam of my flashlight. I pulled out my digital level and pressed it against the underside of the beam. The digital display flickered, then settled on a reading, 4.8 degrees of tilt. This wasn't just deflection. This was structural failure in progress. The wood was crying out, groaning softly against the wind, a sound that was completely drowned out by the jazz band playing 30 feet below. I took out my phone, took 3 high-resolution photos of the bending plate and the splitting timber, and then took a short video of the digital levels reading. I synced the files directly to the county's secure emergency server, CCing the State Safety Board and the State Fire Marshal's regional office. This was my paperwork. This was the cold, hard, unassailable proof of a catastrophe waiting to happen. Richard had thought he could build an empire on a foundation of lies and cheap substitutions, and he had thought he could cast me aside because I was too old, too plain, and too honest for his new shiny life. But he forgot that a building doesn't care about your wealth, your status, or your beautiful young wife. A building only cares about the laws of physics, and those laws are absolute. I climbed down the ladder, my boots hitting the concrete floor of the service corridor with a solid, echoing thud. I wiped the cold sweat and the dust from my forehead with the back of my sleeve. I was no longer just a mother who had been uninvited to Christmas. I was the structural safety inspector on duty, and I had a job to do. I walked back into the mechanical room where Silas was waiting, his face pale as he looked at his tablet, which was now flashing with the data I had just uploaded. "Annette," Silas said, his voice trembling slightly. "The automated system just triggered a red alert based on your data. The structural integrity index has dropped below 70%. We have to clear the building. I know, I said, my voice steady and calm. Call the fire department. Tell them to initiate an emergency evacuation. I'm going out there to tell Richard myself. Silas looked at me, a mixture of respect and fear in his eyes. He's going to fight you on this, Annette. He's got half the city council in that room. Let him fight, I said, reaching down to grab my clipboard with the official emergency closure order. He's about to find out what happens when you build on a broken foundation. I pushed open the heavy double doors leading from the service corridor into the grand ballroom. The transition was like stepping from a frozen concrete vault straight into a roaring golden furnace. The heat hit my face first, thick with the scent of roasted rosemary, prime rib, and the sweet, expensive perfume of 300 wealthy guests. The jazz trio was playing a slow, sultry rendition of Silver Bells. The light from the massive wrought iron chandeliers danced off the crystal champagne flutes and the shimmering fabrics of designer gowns. I didn't stop to wipe the melting snow from my shoulders. I walked straight onto the polished concrete floor, my heavy, salt-stained work boots making a wet, squeaking sound with every step. My bright yellow safety parka, crisscrossed with reflective silver tape, practically glowed under the soft lighting. I was a glaring yellow stain on their perfect silver and white Christmas Eve canvas. As I moved through the crowd, the laughter around me began to falter. Conversations died down to whispers. People nudged each other, pointing at the middle-aged woman in the mud-spattered safety gear carrying a battered aluminum clipboard and a digital level. I saw the looks. I saw the amused smirks, the raised eyebrows, the subtle shifts as people stepped back to avoid getting their silk and velvet brushed by my wet sleeve. If you have ever had to walk into a room where you are clearly not wanted, wearing the uniform of your hard labor, while everyone else is dressed for a fairy tale, then you know the dry, tight feeling in your throat. You feel every eye on you. You feel the weight of their judgment, their silent assumption that you are beneath them because your hands are calloused and your face is lined from years of working in the elements. But I want to tell you something, and I want you to hold on to it the next time you feel out of place. Silk doesn't keep the world from collapsing. Steel and concrete do. And so does the quiet, unyielding truth of a woman who knows exactly how the world is built. I spotted Richard near the towering fireplace. He was holding a crystal glass, gesturing expansively as he spoke to a local county commissioner. Chloe was at his side, her hand resting on his arm, her diamond bracelet catching the firelight. Lauren was standing just behind them, smiling that tight, practiced smile she had started using since she entered her father's circle. As I approached, Richard's eyes found me. I watched the color drain from his face, replaced instantly by a flush of dark, furious red. He excused himself from the commissioner and stepped forward to intercept me, his stride quick and aggressive. Chloe followed close behind, her heels clicking sharply on the floor, while Lauren trailed them, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer embarrassment. "Annette," Lauren whispered, her voice cracking as she reached me first. She looked around the room, her cheeks burning. "Mom, what are you doing here? I told you. I asked you not to come. Why are you dressed like that? You're making a scene." I looked at my daughter. My chest ached, a deep, hollow throb that made it hard to breathe for a split second. But I kept my eyes level and my voice soft. "I'm not here as your mother tonight, Lauren. I'm here as the Deputy Structural Safety Inspector for St. Louis County." "What is the meaning of this, Annette?" Richard hissed, stepping between me and Lauren. He kept his voice low, his teeth clenched, trying desperately to maintain the illusion of control. "Are you completely out of your mind? You're trespassing at a private, invitation-only charity event. If you don't turn around and walk out of here right now, I will have security drag you out into the snow." "You could try, Richard," I said, my voice carrying the flat, calm authority of someone who has shut down multi-million-dollar municipal projects with a single signature. "But the sheriff's deputies are already on their way, and they aren't here to escort me. They're here to assist with the evacuation." "Evacuation?" Chloe stepped forward, her voice rising in a shrill, petulant tone that drew the attention of several nearby guests. "What is she talking about, Richard? Tell this woman to leave. This is my night. We spent 6 months planning this." "There isn't going to be a night, Chloe," I said, looking her dead in the eye. I didn't say it with malice. I said it with the cold, hard certainty of a physics equation. "The roof is failing." Richard let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "The roof? You've got to be kidding me. This building is a state-of-the-art facility. I built it myself. It's rated for twice the current snow load. You're pathetic, Annette. You're so bitter about the divorce, so desperate for attention, that you're trying to ruin my grand opening with some manufactured safety scare. It's sad, really." "I'm going to give you one chance to handle this quietly, Richard," I said, ignoring his insults entirely. I tapped the screen of my tablet and turned it toward him, showing the high-resolution images of the splitting Douglas fir beams and the bending quarter-inch steel gusset plates. "This is arch number 3, right above where your jazz band is playing. The deflection is at 4.8 inches and accelerating. You substituted utility-grade pine for the specified architectural-grade Douglas fir to pocket $300,000. The connector plates are bowing. The wood is splitting. If you don't begin clearing this room immediately, those beams are going to shear, and 300 people are going to be buried under 300 tons of wet snow." Richard stared at the images on the screen. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of absolute terror in his eyes. He knew. He knew exactly what he had done during that transition period 18 months ago. He knew the shortcuts he had taken. But then, his pride, that massive, fragile monument to his own ego, took over. "These are old photos," he lied, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You're fabricating this. The building is perfectly safe. I'm not shutting down this event. Do you have any idea who is in this room? The mayor is on his way. The local news crew is already downstairs in the lobby, preparing to do a live broadcast of our charity presentation at midnight. I am not going to let you humiliate me." "I'm not humiliating you, Richard. You did that to yourself when you decided that a few $100,000 in profit was worth more than the lives of the people who trust you," I said. I looked past him to Lauren, who was watching us, her face pale, her hands trembling as she held her glass of wine. "Lauren, I need you to listen to me. I need you to walk out of this building right now. Go to your car. Get away from the pavilion." "Mom," Lauren stammered, looking back and forth between me and her father. Is it really that bad?" "Dad, she wouldn't lie about this." "Mom doesn't lie." "Don't listen to her, Lauren," Richard snapped, grabbing Lauren's arm a little too tightly. "She's trying to manipulate you. She's trying to tear down everything we've built because she has nothing of her own. She's just a bitter, lonely woman who works in the mud while we build the future." That word, bitter, hung in the warm, scented air of the ballroom. It was his favorite weapon, the label men like him use to dismiss women who refuse to let them slide by on lies. I took a deep breath. I felt the familiar heavy ache in my chest, the grief of seeing my daughter stand beside the man who had traded our family's safety and integrity for a glittering facade. But beneath that grief, there was a solid, unshakable foundation. "You have exactly 8 minutes, Richard," I said, my voice steady, carrying clearly over the soft jazz music. "At midnight, the local news is going live from your lobby. I've already sent the structural telemetry and the emergency closure order to the State Safety Board, the Fire Marshal, and the news station's editorial desk. If you do not announce a voluntary, precautionary evacuation due to the weather within the next 5 minutes, the fire department will enter this room with sirens blaring. The news crew won't be broadcasting your charity presentation. They will be broadcasting your immediate municipal shutdown for structural negligence. Your choice." Richard stared at me, his chest heaving, his face turning a dangerous, mottled purple. He looked at the tablet, then at the crowded ballroom, and finally at the ceiling, where a soft, almost imperceptible creak echoed above the music, a sound only a structural inspector or a guilty developer could truly hear. He was trapped, and he knew it. He had built his entire life on appearances, and now those very appearances were about to crush him. I turned my back on him, my boots squeaking on the polished concrete as I began my walk toward the exit. I didn't look back to see if Lauren was following me. I had given her the truth. Now she had to choose what kind of foundation she wanted to build her own life upon. I pushed through the heavy service doors and walked back out into the freezing, honest dark of the northern storm. The cold outside didn't just bite, it took ownership of the air. The moment I pushed through those heavy glass doors, the howling wind off Lake Superior slammed into me like a physical wall, carrying a thick sheet of white that stung my eyes and coated my eyelashes in instant frost. Down here on the lakefront, there was no shelter. The water was a black, thrashing beast, throwing freezing spray over the concrete pier, where it immediately hardened into a treacherous glaze. I stood on the wide concrete steps of the lakeside pavilion, my yellow safety parka ballooning in the gale. Across the parking lot, the flashing red and blue lights of the first emergency vehicles were already cutting through the driving snow. Silas had kept his word. The high-pitched wail of the sirens was swallowed by the roar of the blizzard, but the strobe lights painted the white drifts in rhythmic, violent pulses of crimson and cobalt. I want to ask you something. Have you ever stood in the freezing dark, watching a storm roll in, knowing that you are the only thing standing between a room full of people and a terrible tragedy? It is a lonely feeling. Your heart beats in your throat, and every breath you take feels like inhaling ground glass. You wonder if they'll hate you for ruining their beautiful, expensive night. You wonder if your own child will ever forgive you for pulling back the curtain on the lie she wanted so badly to believe. But then you look at your hands, the hands that have held blueprints, the hands that have tightened bolts, the hands that have wiped away your child's tears when she was small, and you remember that your job isn't to be liked. Your job is to keep them safe. I walked down the steps, my steel-toed boots crunching through the fresh crust of snow, and made my way toward the county emergency vehicle parked near the entrance. Silas was leaning against the hood, his radio crackling with static-heavy transmissions from the dispatch office. Next to him was Chief Miller of the Duluth Fire Department, his heavy turnout gear already dusted with white. "The structural integrity index is down to 68%, Annette," Silas said, his voice raw as he yelled over the wind. "The sensors on Arch 4 are starting to spike now, too. We're putting the evacuation order into effect immediately." "Good," I nodded, my face stiff from the cold. "Richard isn't going to cooperate. He tried to claim the data was fabricated. He's got half the city council in there, and he's terrified of looking like a failure on his big night." Chief Miller grunted, adjusting his helmet. "He doesn't have a choice anymore. My boys are going in through the front doors right now. We're pulling the fire alarms if we have to. Nobody stays in that tinderbox." Just as the chief finished speaking, the double doors of the pavilion flew open, and a wave of warm light spilled out onto the snow. But it wasn't the orderly, polite exit Richard would have wanted. The alarm hadn't sounded yet, but the sight of 3 fire engines and a half-dozen sheriff's cruisers pulling up to the curb had triggered a panic of its own. People in tuxedos and floor-length silk gowns were pouring out into the freezing night, their patent leather shoes slipping on the icy pavement. Women were wrapping their bare shoulders in whatever they could find: expensive linen tablecloths, velvet cloaks, or the cheap yellow survival blankets the emergency crews were handing out. The laughter and the jazz music were gone, replaced by the chaotic shouting of valets trying to find luxury vehicles in a blinding snowstorm and the sharp, urgent commands of the first responders. And then, the local news crew arrived. They had been scheduled to do a live, heartwarming broadcast at midnight about Richard's charitable donations to the city. Instead, their satellite van pulled up right behind the fire trucks, its hydraulic mast rising into the snowy sky like a metal finger pointing at the sky. A young reporter named Brenda Vance, whom I'd seen on the Channel 3 evening news for years, hopped out of the passenger side, her microphone already in hand, followed closely by a cameraman struggling to keep his heavy equipment dry under a plastic tarp. Brenda spotted Silas and the fire chief immediately, but then her eyes locked onto me. She knew who I was. In a town like Duluth, if you work in municipal safety for 30 years, people know your face. They know you're the one who signs the permits and stops the unsafe builds. "Annette Ross?" Brenda called out, her voice loud and clear even against the wind. She scrambled over a snowbank, the cameraman trailing her. "Annette, is it true? Is the county shutting down the lakeside pavilion? We were told this was a minor weather delay, but we're seeing fire crews entering the building with structural support jacks." Before I could answer, a loud, furious voice cut through the clamor. "Turn that camera off!" Richard was marching down the steps, his expensive tuxedo jacket open, his bow tie undone and hanging around his neck. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Behind him, Chloe was clinging to his arm, shivering violently in her silver dress, her perfect hair ruined by the wet snow, looking like a drowned bird. And behind them, both came Lauren, her green dress covered by a dark wool coat, her face pale and frozen with shock. "This is a massive misunderstanding," Richard shouted, stepping directly in front of Brenda's microphone. He tried to force a confident, charming smile for the camera, but his eyes were wild, darting back and forth between the lens and me. "The building is perfectly safe. St. Louis County is overreacting to a routine snow load. We are pausing the event purely as a precautionary measure because of the road conditions. My development company stands by the integrity of this structure. Is that true, Deputy Inspector Ross?" Brenda Vance turned the microphone toward me, the cameraman shifting his angle to frame me in the bright, harsh glare of the halogen camera light. I stood my ground. I didn't look at Richard. I didn't look at Chloe, who was glaring at me with spitfire in her eyes. I looked directly into the camera lens. I knew that thousands of people across the North Shore were sitting in their warm living rooms right now, watching this broadcast, waiting to see if their loved ones at the gala were safe. "No, it is not true," I said, my voice steady, clear, and carrying the weight of 30 years of professional authority. "The Lakeside Pavilion is currently experiencing a critical structural failure. The main laminated timber arches are deflecting nearly 5 inches under the snow load, which is well past the safety margin. This failure is a direct result of unauthorized material substitutions made during construction." "You're lying!" Richard roared, stepping closer, his fist clenched. "You're a disgruntled former employee." "I have never worked for you, Richard," I interrupted, my voice remaining perfectly level, a sharp contrast to his frantic shouting. "I work for the people of this county. And right now, the county's secure database has the digital records of the original engineering approvals, which specified Grade 1 Douglas fir and half-inch steel gusset plates. My physical inspection tonight confirmed that those materials were substituted with utility-grade pine and quarter-inch stamped plates. The plates are bending. The wood is splitting. If we hadn't evacuated this room, the roof would have collapsed on 300 citizens before morning." The silence that followed my words was absolute, save for the howling of the wind. Even Brenda Vance seemed taken aback by the sheer weight of the technical evidence I had just laid out on live television. The cameraman zoomed in on the rugged tablet I held in my hand, which was displaying the high-resolution images of the cracked beams and the bent steel plates, the very images I had uploaded to the state server 20 minutes ago. Richard looked at the tablet, then at the camera, and finally at the crowd of wealthy donors and local politicians who were standing in the snow, listening to every word. The illusion was gone. The grand facade he had spent 3 years and millions of dollars building had collapsed in a matter of seconds, not under the weight of the snow, but under the weight of the truth. This is a technical dispute," Richard stammered, his voice losing its strength, his face turning a sickly, pale white. We had engineering sign-offs." "Your sign-offs were obtained fraudulently, Richard," I said, holding up the physical emergency closure order I had signed. "The State Safety Board has already initiated a formal investigation into your building permits. This facility is officially condemned until further notice." I turned away from him and looked at the fire crews who were now escorting the last of the guests out of the lobby. And then my eyes found Lauren. She was standing just outside the bright circle of the camera light, her hands pressed against her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and profound realization. She had heard it all. She had seen the raw data. She had seen her father's desperate, ugly lies exposed to the world, and she had seen the mother she had uninvited, the mother she thought was too plain, too bitter, and too embarrassing for her new life, standing in the storm, saving the lives of everyone she had been trying so hard to impress. Our eyes met through the swirling snow. I didn't smile. I didn't offer her a look of triumph. I only gave her the quiet, sad gaze of a mother who had tried to warn her daughter that you cannot build a life on sand. I walked past the news crew, past the shouting valets, and back to my old 4-wheel drive truck. I climbed into the cab, my joints aching from the freezing cold, and shut the door, cutting off the sound of the storm. The heater groaned as it began to blow lukewarm air through the vents. I leaned my head against the steering wheel and let out a long, shuddering breath. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving behind a deep, heavy exhaustion that settled into my bones. It was 12:15 on Christmas morning. My phone, resting in the cup holder, began to buzz. The screen lit up, reflecting against the frosted windshield. It was Lauren. I picked up the phone, my fingers stiff and cold, and pressed the receiver to my ear. I didn't say anything. I just listened to the quiet static of the line. "Mom?" Lauren's voice came through, but it didn't have that high-pitched, negotiating quality anymore. It was small. It was trembling, cracked with cold and tears. "Mom, I'm standing in the parking lot. The firemen are putting up yellow tape around the building. I just saw you on the news feed on my phone. Why are you on the news, Mom? What did Dad do?" I looked through the frosted side window of my truck, watching the flashing red lights of the fire engines paint the snowy dark. "He built a house of cards, Lauren," I said softly, the weariness clear in my voice. "And he expected the winter not to come." "Get in your car, Lauren," I said, my voice barely louder than the low, rhythmic hum of the truck's heater. I kept my eyes on the frosted windshield, watching the red and blue emergency lights paint the swirling snow in rhythmic pulses. "Turn the heater on high. Don't try to drive until the county plows clear the main road. Just sit there, keep your seatbelt on, and stay warm." "Mom, please don't hang up," she sobbed. It was a sound I hadn't heard in years, not since she was a little girl who had scraped her knee on the gravel driveway of our old house. It was the raw, gasping sound of her armor cracking, the glittering, expensive armor her father had bought her, which turned out to be nothing but cheap, thin tin. "I'm so sorry. I was so stupid. I thought they cared about me. I thought we were a family. But when the firemen came in and started shouting, Dad didn't even look for me. He was just screaming at the manager, trying to save his VIP list. He left me in the crowd, Mom. He left me to find my own way out in the dark." There is a terrible, quiet grief in watching your child realize that the person they traded you for doesn't actually love them. It is not a moment for triumph. If you've ever wanted to say, "I told you so," to someone you love, only to find the words taste like cold ash in your mouth, then you know exactly what I felt. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt the heavy, familiar ache of a mother who wishes she could have shielded her child from the harshness of the world, even when that child was the one who swung the hammer that broke our home. "I know, baby," I said softly, the old instinctual nickname slipping out before I could stop it. "I know. Go home. We'll talk tomorrow." I hung up the phone and put the truck in gear. The drive back to my neighborhood was slow, the heavy tires catching on the deep, unplowed drifts of the Canal Park Bridge, but my hands were steady on the steering wheel. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the small yellow house looked exactly as I had left it. It was quiet. It was humble. The single string of multicolored C9 Christmas bulbs I'd hung along the porch railing was half buried in snow, glowing softly through the white drifts like little buried stars. I went inside, hung my wet yellow parka on the peg by the door, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who has done her duty. The next morning, Christmas Day, was silent. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world wrapped in a thick, blindingly white blanket of fresh lake-effect snow. The sun came up over Lake Superior, casting a cold, brilliant blue light across the ice. I sat at my scrubbed pine table, holding a warm mug of chicory coffee, watching the steam rise into the cold morning air. On the local news, the story was already blowing up. They showed footage of the lakeside pavilion from the night before, the flashing emergency lights, the panicked guests in their evening wear, and the clips of my live interview with Brenda Vance. The anchor described it as a near catastrophe averted by the vigilance of the county inspector's office. But the real story wasn't the snow. It was the investigation that followed. Over the next 3 weeks, the foundation of Richard's empire didn't just crack, it completely dissolved. The state licensing board suspended his developer's license by noon on December 26th. The city council, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, ordered an immediate, independent audit of every single project Ross Development had touched in the last 10 years. The bank, seeing the writing on the wall, called in the loans on the Lakeside Pavilion and his North Shore estate, and, as I knew she would, Chloe didn't stay to watch the collapse. When the leased German sports cars were repossessed and the bank accounts were frozen, she packed her designer suitcases and took a flight to Miami. She didn't look back. She had married a facade, and when the facade crumbled, she had no use for the rubble. Richard was left alone in a rented 2-bedroom apartment in West Duluth, facing 3 counts of building code fraud and a mountain of civil lawsuits from the wealthy donors he had endangered. I didn't feel joy in his ruin. When you spend your life inspecting broken things, you don't celebrate the collapse. You just study the debris so you can build better next time. It was mid-January when the knock came on my kitchen door. I was standing by the stove, waiting for the copper kettle to whistle. The smell of cinnamon, yeast, and cardamom filled the kitchen. I was finally baking the Swedish tea rings I had planned to make on Christmas Eve. I opened the door, and there stood Lauren. She wasn't wearing the emerald green designer dress or the heavy wool coat her father had bought her. She was wearing a simple, faded winter jacket she'd kept from her college years, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her cheeks red from the biting North Shore wind. She looked younger. She looked tired. She looked like the daughter I had raised before the glitter of Richard's money had blinded her. She carried a small paper bag from the local bakery, her fingers twitching against the paper. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Hi, Lauren," I replied, stepping aside to let her in. She walked into the warm kitchen, her boots dripping melted snow onto the linoleum. She stood there for a moment, looking around the room as if she were checking to see if the ghosts of her betrayal were still sitting in the corners. Then, her eyes landed on the scrubbed pine table. "Can I sit down?" she asked. "Always," I said. She pulled out the old wooden chair, the one with the slight wobble in the left leg that I've always meant to fix, and sat. She set the paper bag on the table and pulled out a small blue glass jar filled with Lake Superior agates she'd collected over the years. She'd kept them in her old bedroom upstairs. It was a quiet peace offering, an acknowledgement of where she came from. "I got a job, Mom," she said, looking down at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "At the County Land Registry office. It's entry level. It doesn't pay much, but it's real. And I moved into an apartment on 4th Street. It's small, and the radiator clanks at night, but I'm paying the rent myself." I poured the boiling water into my ceramic teapot, the steam rising between us like a soft, warm veil. "I'm proud of you, Lauren. That's a good place to start." "I was so awful to you, Mom," she said, and this time, the tears did fall, big and heavy, splashing onto the scrubbed pine wood. "I was so embarrassed of the work you do, of how we lived. I wanted so badly to be part of that shiny world where nobody had to worry about money or hard work. I thought if I made Chloe feel like family, I could finally be part of it too. But it was all a lie. When the roof started creaking, Dad didn't care about me. He only cared about his name on the wall." I walked over to the table, set the teapot down, and pulled up the chair next to her. I didn't hug her immediately. I let her feel the weight of her tears. I let her understand that some foundations, once cracked,